We all know I'm a dumb one, especially on this show, Tiana being an actually trained economist. Why don't you take lead and I can try and scramble and put some thoughts together here. Welcome back to On Deadline, the Washington Examiner's political game show. I'm Christian Daytalk.
And I'm Tiana Lowe-Desher.
Each episode, we bring you the week's biggest political stories, deliver our takes, and then at the end, you get to pick a winner. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Like we do every week, we're starting above the fold. Tiana, you're getting a minute to talk about the biggest story on your plate. Let us know.
As Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is wont to do, he made headlines after an appearance on the All In podcast.
Let's say Social Security didn't send out their checks this month. My mother-in-law, who's 94, she wouldn't call and complain. I would never allow, if I can stand it, to not pay somebody who retired at 65 their benefits.
This messaging understands that Social Security and entitlements more broadly are considered the third rail of politics, but it's clear that the Trump administration doesn't understand why. How schizophrenic is it, the idea that the current beneficiaries of Social Security, they can afford a missed payment, but future ones don't? This is also not borne out in the data. 27% of seniors today have no other income for Social Security. In a poll by Bankrate, they found that half of all boomers say that they will be very reliant on Social Security, but that number goes increasingly downwards. Why? Because the 22% of millennials who say that they'll be very reliant on Social Security are the minority, whereas the rest of us understand it won't be there. In just 8 years, when Social Security hits insolvency, that's a 23% across-the-board benefit cut. And so this is my issue, Christian, with the idea of we have to protect Social Security at all costs. God forbid we increase the retirement age 23% when that's how much life expectancy has increased since that retirement age was set. They'd rather, rob from the children to pay. Why would you have a system where the 94-year-old mother-in-law, who statistically speaking does actually rely on expecting that benefit today, when our generation, we made clear 73% of non-retired folks know they won't receive their promised benefits because we won't, because the Trump administration's official policy is do nothing and let that insolvency hit.
Tiana, I'm going to put aside the policy points of your argument because I don't disagree with you at all there. I want to ask you about sort of the messaging behind what Lutnick and Scott Bessent at Treasury and even Donald Trump are saying, because it seems to me like they're telling voters, hey, stick with our plan because down the line it's going to be so much better for you. Ignore the short-term pain. Ignore grandma maybe missing one Social Security check. Correct me if I'm wrong. This sounds exactly like what Joe Biden was saying, which failed to resonate with voters. So do you think this is a strategic miscalculation, perhaps just an unseen pitfall of Trump's agenda being implemented, or what the hell is the White House doing here?
Absolutely, when the return on the investment is non-existent, right?
Yeah.
We know that voters they're willing to take a short-term hit for some long-term strategies. We see that with tariffing China. Voters saw COVID and they understand China is a threat. They say, okay, we will take slightly increased prices if it means decoupling from China. When Lutnick is lying, saying that, it's just the waste, fraud, and abuse in Social Security that is the reason why it's going up. Again, not borne out in the data. In order to stave off insolvency without spending reform, payroll taxes would need to rise by at least 25%. Another way to balance the budget without touching entitlements or defense would require decimating non-defense discretionary by 90%. So no, it's not waste, fraud, and abuse. It's the fact that a bunch of boomers decided not to have kids, and you have a smaller number of workers paying into those retirees, and you never updated the age for the reality that people live so much longer. They live 15 years longer on average than they did when Social Security was originally passed. It's just, and I understand my faction of the GOP lost, right? Nikki Haley was expressly running in that 2024 primary on, no, we need to touch Social Security if we want to have any sort of means-tested retirement program for the least privileged. I think we all recognize that. We don't want seniors being homeless. But why should I expect a payout from the government when instead I could spend money in my 401k that has orders of magnitude times the investment?
Yeah. It's definitely, I think, like you've mentioned a strategic error and one that voters, probably in the midterm elections, won't forget about.
Christian, what's the top story you're following?
Well, over the past 2 weeks, Donald Trump seems to be losing it a little bit. He's shortened his public appearances. He's started calling for impeaching federal judges. And perhaps most importantly, he's resurrected those post-midnight, rage-filled, stream of consciousness rants. And I think it's clear the president has lost the plot here. And if you don't believe me, let's just go look at his Truth Social account from Sunday night, where he wasn't talking about policy. He was talking about this, the portrait of himself hanging in the Colorado State Capitol. Is it unflattering? Sure. Is it impactful on anyone else's lives? Actually, let me check my notes right here. It impacts literally no one. This is not what Republican voters signed up for, no matter what they might tell you on X, the Everything app. Voters want to see prices come down. They want to see the crisis at the border addressed. They don't want to see Donald Trump degenerating to the worst version of himself when he was in office the first time around. Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, needs to get this ship under control. Otherwise, the chaos boulder is going to be rolling down the hill faster and faster until eventually, like we talked about a second ago, there will be electoral consequences.
Attitudinally, I think part of the reason Trump is so much more popular now than he has been at any other point in his political life is because, like his persona in his pre-political life, he's been much more of a happy warrior.
Yeah.
Like this time around than he was, especially, oh my gosh, all of 2020 was one long I'm a victim slog, and it was just, it wasn't fun to root for, right? This reeks of a little bit of desperation, and it shouldn't be, right? He still controls the government, and in one policy arena, the second most important, immigration, Trump has won categorically. I don't think there is a single Democrat that can make an affirmative case for their immigration agenda, right? There is a reason why he's posting all the videos of DHS frog marching these Tren de Aragua members as they deport them out to El Salvador, because the rest of the country is like, yes, we don't want these criminals here. It's like he can't fathom that the first part of the mandate, the first goal is affordability.
Yep.
And it does not help when Scott Bessent, who literally lived in a mansion called the Pink Palace, is saying cheap goods aren't a part of the American dream. Okay, well, like, they're not the entire thing, but isn't part of it that, like, how many people say, oh, I want to come here to buy my own house and have a nice car, and, like, it's not the only thing, but it does matter. The affordability element does matter. And Trump's never had a stock market like this that's getting so distrustful. But there's a reason why investors are squeamish of all of this, and Trump's clearly taking it personally because he used to be the market's favorite guy.
He's taking it personally, and I actually really like your point about how he was sort of the happy warrior on the campaign trail back in 2016 in those early pre-COVID years in office. This time around, it's someone else filling that role. It's J.D. Vance instead of Donald Trump, who, other than really that blow up on President Zelensky in the Oval Office, has sort of been the one to do the damage control because Trump is getting so personal with these attacks and taking it out of the policy sphere. Meanwhile, we've got J.D. Vance coming in and explaining things in a much more nuanced, again, tone is key, a nuanced sort of joyful, shout out Kamala Harris, approach. And it's startling, especially considering the sort of arm's length that the Trump White House has held Vance at. Even though he's got all of these high-profile items on his policy plate, the president hasn't endorsed him ahead of 2028, even though he is the presumptive nominee. It's interesting, and I think it's sort of the cherry on top of Donald Trump's extended honeymoon period coming to an end.
Time for yays and nays when we give our opinion on the news of the week. Sometimes we'll agree, other times we'll disagree.
Trump's remaking of the U.S. education system is working.
I think it's working in a sense. He's definitely getting results. And it's really not even just his pledge to, destroy the Department of Education and return those budgets and those decisions to the states. I mean, the pressure campaign he's put on places like Columbia University, where they're now bowing to his demands or risk losing, like $400 million in federal funding. He's moving the needle. I don't know if it's in a positive direction. I would argue it's probably not. But you can't say the man isn't fundamentally changing the system in that regard. He is certainly successful.
I I think it's working in a way that a lot of conservatives would not consider a victory in the end. It's working in that it's giving the power back to the actual research functions and academic functions of the university, right?
Yeah.
There was a very interesting Wall Street Journal report a week back about the Columbia Civil War, where you have a lot of the people with the most outsized power over the university and the ones who favored all the activism over the last, oh my gosh, I say 5 years, but really it's been before that,
What
right?
even
You and
is
I,
time, right?
What is time? But like you and I were both there, I think, in the generation of, oh, we need to scream down every single speaker. How dare Ann Coulter speak? How dare Ben Shapiro speak? And like the whole activist class of academics supported that. But where the monetary value of a university comes into play, both in terms of the return on the actual investment and why Uncle Sam is an investor in the university, are a lot of those STEM fields, right? There are other humanities that do research, but no one's donating to, $100 million to Columbia in the name of diversity. They're doing so in the name of cancer treatment.
Yeah.
Or they're doing so in the name of, financial engineering research. And so this really does give a lot of power back to the hard academics.
It does.
I hope that also, as we talk about how much money these schools have, it helps the House Republicans consider going after those endowments. Because what TCJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 did, for the first time it put the endowments on the table. And it was a very small tax, right? Like 2% of the university endowments. But we know it's like the most amount of income inequality you could imagine. That is what the universities are in actuality. Something like 29 universities have larger endowments than the rest of all the universities combined. And if you had an endowment that just applied to those universities, not only would you get more money, but also Harvard can no longer just be a tax-exempt hedge fund.
Yeah.
Yale can no longer get away with, the people of New Haven get mad because Yale doesn't pay taxes. And so and this is why I'm saying I don't know if conservatives will love what this victory looks like, but from an academic perspective, not in terms of getting rid of liberal bias, because I think if you go into academics from a distributional perspective, you're more likely to be liberal, but in terms of reclaiming the actual intent and origin of what a university is supposed to be, I think it does work.
I want to pick up that line on, conservatives, how they will score this down the line. But your point about returning power to academia, I think, is especially important right now, considering when it comes to all this medical research, the Trump administration is turning the spigot off in a lot of areas of private research, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, we've talked about it during Trump's first presidency, Joe Biden's presidency, and now we're doing it again. The desire to end cancer, that's going to cost a lot of money, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. So these universities are going to need to stand up more and take a more vocal role in that sphere if other private firms are shut down and no longer have access to federal funding. Hypothetically, will conservatives think that Donald Trump's education agenda is successful if they lose the White House in 2028, a Democratic president comes in and says, we're just going to stand up the Department of Education again because there was no congressional backstop formally dissolving the department, which we do know needs to happen.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they can just, refund it and restaff, and then we're back to square one.
I mean, this is why I'm saying, I think that conservatives might not consider it a partisan victory because there's nothing that's been done so far to say, oh, we're not turning every single campus into Hillsdale, right? But also that shouldn't necessarily be the point.
No, you want diversity of thought.
Yes, and some of this is a little bit like lucky timing for Trump. Trump is really the right man at the right moment. But consider Harvard University gets rid of test scores in order to make it less clear that they're totally violating the Supreme Court overturning the right to do affirmative action, right? What's the easiest way to make sure that you don't admit too many Asians because apparently we're scary or antisocial or something? Just get rid of the test scores so you can't prove that other people were overlooked. As a result, Harvard now has to have a remedial algebra class. I finished algebra in 7th grade, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I was a late bloomer, maybe 8th grade for me.
But I think it's more headlines like that in tandem with the great failed experiment of removing testing and COVID and the decrease in K through 12 education scores because of those school shutdowns and Trump altogether, it really is going to be a seismic shift away from that enormous post-Great Recession university bubble. It's finally burst, I think.
Up next, it's time for us to fill in that blank.
The Federal Reserve's decision not to cut rates shows blank.
We all know I'm a dumb one, especially on this show, Tiana being an actually trained economist. Why don't you take lead and I can try and scramble and put some thoughts together here?
It shows everything is paused until there is clarity on what the hell is going on with the tariffs. So to Trump's credit, his first full month in office, February, produced great inflation reports, right? And in part, you had inflation not only halve from January to February, but specifically because of things that Trump did, right? There were 100 more oil and gas rigs in operation from November to February of this year. And that is in large part because of Trump policy. It's giving the green
red
light.
Tape. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And that didn't even include the reduction in egg prices, which are down 22% from the peak. So once that gets added in there, that's going to be a huge value add for that inflation number. But 1 month does not a trend make. The Fed historically likes to see at least 3 good months of things going in the right direction. But Jerome Powell said it outright. We can't do anything because we don't know the inflationary impact of the tariffs. I was talking to a very smart investor who knows everyone in the Republican Wall Street world. And there are fears that we will actually get a negative Q1 of GDP growth because so many people are holding off making large durable goods purchases, expanding, because they don't know, are we only tariffing final goods? Or if you're sending over a car part to Canada, is that being tariffed, right? No one knows yet. And that's a lot of the mess you're seeing in the stock market. The China tariffs aren't really driving the markets downward because everyone had already priced them in. There was an understanding we are decoupling from China. All these companies have already brought in factories and they're continuing to try and do so. It's Mexico, Canada, EU, reciprocal tariffs. Christian, I think people don't understand each country has a different menu of tariffs for the goods, and they theoretically aren't supposed to discriminate too much against other specific countries unless you already have a free trade agreement. Because of that, if Trump is doing reciprocal tariffs, let's say Colombia tariffs pineapples.
The country, not the university. Just
the country.
At home. Yeah.
Let's just say they tariff pineapples at 15%, but oranges at 10%. If Trump is matching reciprocal tariffs item to item, country to country, that would require 2.3 million distinctive levies.
It's a lot.
What a disaster that makes for if you're at the border and you're factoring, you're debating what to make orders of. Oh, let me look up the menu of 2.3 million options. What business can operate in that environment?
I mean, it's really the opposite of their overriding, sort of pro-growth, allegedly, strategy. Like we want to slash red tape. That hinders innovation, hinders growth. This is the opposite. It's making it more complicated for these American firms to figure out what they want to do down the line. Again, economically, no notes. I've got nothing for you. I see this as sort of a little bit of political gamesmanship here. We've heard a lot about how Donald Trump is steamrolling Congress. He's trying to put his thumb on the scale over at judiciary. It seems like Jerome Powell and the Fed, an independent organization, are willing to stand up to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So basically, he doesn't have a stranglehold over the entire, Washington, D.C. bureaucratic apparatus like he, A, might thought he had, and B, specifically wants. I mean, we've heard from the White House for at least a month, people like Peter Navarro, Caroline Leavitt, Donald Trump himself, they are calling for the Fed to lower rates. This pumping of the brakes, like you pointed out, based purely on confusion and volatility driven by the Trump administration's own economic agenda, they're not going to bend over and, be Chuck Schumer and let Donald Trump do whatever he wants. I mean, I see this as a positive sign in terms of checks and balances, the levers of power in Washington. And to anyone at home who's a card-carrying member of the resistance, something like that, I think you should look at this and say, oh, okay, the sky isn't falling. We will still have a country at the end of all of this.
Yeah.
Democracy is operating the way it's supposed to operate.
Let us know who you think won this week's clash, and don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode. And please share this video with your friends across your social media platforms. In the meantime, visit thewashingtonexaminer.com. I'm Tiana Lodesher.
And I'm Christian Daytalk.
And we will see you next week.